I've been working at Funding Circle for almost a year now, and I'm sure we've had some really interesting talks, and I hope I don't drop the baton at the very last mark. So without further ado, yes, let's talk about health and safety at the engineering coalface. Now, there are no coalfaces involved, unfortunately, but what we're actually going to talk about in a little bit more detail is how a governance process can really foster communication between different departments and teams, and how it can really help increase the accuracy of engineering changes. So first things first, let's have a quick run through of what we're going to cover today. So firstly, we'll look at what does Funding Circle do, which is just a brief introduction to the business model. Then we'll talk about how, even though previously we've been quick with our processing of applications, we're now moving much more near to an instant decision. And then we'll have a look at how the architecture from a very high level allows us to do that. And then we'll talk about the governance process over one particular portion of that architecture and how that really builds trust and fosters that communication I was alluding to at the beginning. And finally, we'll have some closing thoughts. So first things first, what does Funding Circle do? So we provide finance to small and medium-sized enterprises. Now, these are just small businesses. They, anything on your high street that might be a bakery, a butcher, whatever it might be. And what we're doing is we're providing them finance to help them grow and get the funding they need to win. Now, the important thing to understand here is that Funding Circle isn't lending its own money. What we're actually doing is we're taking a very big pool of money that's been provided by investors, and then we'll be doing the managing of the life cycle of the loan, processing applications, taking repayments, and even actually communicating with that borrower if they become some kind of financial difficulties. Now, there is a word here, origination, that does appear quite a few times within this presentation, but that's just a fancy finance word, which basically just means the processing of an application from receiving it all the way through to actually accepting the offer and then handing the money out to the borrower. So let's just have a quick look at the sort of the scale of what Funding Circle has kind of done since its founding in 2010. So and what I'll do is I'll talk a little bit about how the UK's makeup of those numbers. So Funding Circle covers a couple of different geographies, but in particular, the UK makes up about 7.9 billion of that 13 billion that's been originated. It has lent to 71,000 UK businesses, and currently is responsible for 4.1 billion of those loans under management. So again, just the difference there about the origination, that's just the total money that's been lent since Funding Circle's founding, whereas the loans under management are those loans that currently are still being repaid at the moment. So it's quite interesting to have a look at how we've managed to reach that kind of scale. And one particular point is really just that we've been fast. Now, if you've ever taken a business loan or even just a personal loan or applied for a mortgage, having that processed in sort of 2 to 3 weeks is astonishingly quick. And actually, many banks will take much longer and could even end up taking months of time. So what we've been trying to do is automate that and using the technology of sort of the current day to process applications in a fully automated fashion. As you can see, what we're actually looking at is almost processing that within a couple of minutes, even though the payout may take a couple of days. And then in the future, we're looking to have that whole process kind of done and dusted in a matter of minutes. So how do we kind of achieve that? Well, let's have a quick look at the different technologies in our stack. This is a non-exhaustive list. I kind of gave up after a certain point trying to figure out all the different technologies we use. Myself personally, I actually just use Clojure, Kafka, and then deployments through Jenkins, but we'll be moving to Drone shortly. But I'm sure there's a technology in there for pretty much everyone in the audience. So at the heart of this process where we, the originations process, is something called the decisioning system. Now, this system is really just responsible for working out whether or not we accept or reject a loan. And the important thing is that there's a huge amount of business logic that lives within this system. And it's quite varied, even all the way through from sort of applying the credit risk models all the way through to actually orchestrating when a user needs to input data and also when we need to collect data. Now, it's important distinction here is that although we orchestrate the user journey, the external users and the borrowers are not really the people that we're focused on. What we're actually looking for here is the way that we interact with the risk department. The risk department here is literally just a department that's responsibility lies in managing the risk for Funding Circle. And we'll talk about those in a moment. But ultimately, the thing that we're looking for here is that accept, reject, do I need more data? Now, if we have a look at the architecture from a very high level, you can kind of see it looks a little bit like this. Now, the idea here is that the decisioning system is this very central controlling entity. You can almost think of it like a brain with multiple limbs in the form of different supporting systems. And the idea here is that, let's say you arrived at Funding Circle's webpage in the UI, you entered your details, and you sent that through to the decisioning system. It would then make a decision. Now, in this particular case, it would likely be, I don't have enough information. I'm going to ask for something extra to help make my decision, and that would then get spat out. And one of the supporting systems would then consume that event and say, right, I'm going to go and collect, let's say, an external report, send that back to the decisioning system, and then it would then process and rerun a decision, maybe asking for more data, maybe rejecting, and so on and so forth. Now, the idea here is that each one of these supporting systems has multiple different data structures, and actually underneath all of this, and what I'm trying to avoid here is using any terminology from Kafka, which is the mediating technology between all of this. But the important thing here is that we have many different data structures that come into the decisioning system, and there is only a single data structure that comes out. Now, those many different data structures that come in can be as large and varied as a very large external report with hundreds of different data points, or it could be as simple as a small map with a couple of different data points. Now, unfortunately, what I've done here has been a little bit sneaky and kind of lied to you all, because what we actually have is not one monolith system, but actually two systems that work in tandem with each other. So what we have is the state management and the decision engine. As you can probably guess, the state management's responsibility is purely state, and the decision engine is really the point at where we actually start exercising those responsibilities of the credit risk assessment, eligibility, and so on and so forth. So what we've done is we've pulled all of our business logic within the decision engine itself, and the state management is really just involved around taking any new data structures and aggregating them into a single data structure that gets fed to the engine. Now, this has some very cool properties. So the decision engine you can kind of think of as almost like a pure function. Any decision that's made has no bearing or impact on any later decisions, and it just means that you can kind of think of it in a stateless fashion. And we'll see we've got some quite cool testing ramifications from that later on. So in all of this, obviously, there is the happy path and the sad path, and there is a situation where things can go wrong. And I think the thing to stress here is that when things go wrong for Funding Circle, particularly within just that decision engine, it can be really expensive. So as I alluded to earlier, the money that we are lending is actually an investor's money. It's not our own. Now, what this means is when we make a loan, or if I should say, we make a loan that we shouldn't have done, what we need to do is we need to take the value of that loan and put it aside and just do nothing with it. It's there to make the investor whole again, should that loan default. Now, as you can kind of see from the numbers I put up there, a loan could be up to £500,000, and with thousands of applications that get processed in a month, even a small percentage of that can really lead to some very spiraling costs that can really damage Funding Circle's financial position. So it's the thing that I really try and avoid at all costs. It's the thing I live in fear of, shall I say. Now, there's one key aspect of this that I'd quite like to stress here, which is if we do make a mistake, it's only really catchable by audit. When we make a mistake, it's not something that's going to raise an exception. It's normally the kind of thing that you have to go back, look through the application and see whether or not that data point or that poor feature was there on the loans that were made. So how do we prevent buybacks? Now, ultimately, what we have is a risk department, and their whole job is ultimately, as I mentioned before, to manage risk to Funding Circle as a whole. Now, they also create the credit strategy, and this determines like how risky a given applicant is, be they very, very low risk and very favorable to lend to, or whether or not they're relatively high risk, but we can still lend to them, albeit maybe a premium, and then ultimately those that are so high risk that we would not even lend to them at all. Now, the point here is that although we as engineering are making changes, we need risks input to understand the changes that happen to the system and alleviate any risks that might happen. And this is where the governance process comes in. And this is what we're going to talk about in a little bit more detail. Now, the idea of the governance process here is simply to be building that rapport, that communication, that trust with risk. And the idea here is that it's specific only to the decision engine. It's far more elaborate and rigorous than the vast majority of what we consider to be normal requirement gathering and the testing of software, and is really unique within Funding Circle as well. No other application is kind of subject to this kind of scrutiny. Now, the idea about the governing process is that it's not really about increasing the speed of change. It's not really about anything to do with that. It's more about the accuracy of that change. And the only way you can develop that accuracy of change and making sure that you're not introducing any risk is by bringing risk along on the journey. So you can see here we've got a couple of different steps within the governance process. And there are three that we're going to look into in a little bit more detail, which is the pitch, the testing of the change, and the release document. So first things first, let's talk about the pitch. So it's just a very lightweight document, and the whole idea here is that the audience is not other engineers so much as other people within the risk department or even product and commercial people. And the idea here is that we're demonstrating that we understand the change that's been requested. We're trying to communicate to risk that this is what we are going to do. We're not going to color outside of these lines, and these are the potential ramifications of what happens when we make that change. Now, again, the idea here is that we're trying to make and communicate the change in as simple as way as possible. So we're removing a lot of tech jargon, and we're trying to break down those barriers that a very complex system will have to understanding. And so we often talk about things in the terms of different business rules, but it's always a shared language between us and risk. Now, ultimately, risk gets sign off on the pitch, and once the pitch has been signed off, we'll move on to the implementation, and then finally we'll actually start looking at testing. Now, I'm sure most of you will be familiar with unit tests, scenario tests, integration tests, but the two at the bottom are probably a little bit more interesting. Now, as I keep on stressing here, the system is highly complex, and we as engineers obviously need to have multiple different layers of testing to stress test those different aspects of the features that we're creating. And that's where we're doing this here. Now, I'd like to have one little segue here to just call out Clara rules, which is based on the RETE or RETE algorithm. I can't honestly say I know how I'm supposed to say that. But the idea of this open source library is effectively, if you have many different business rules, and the output of a business rule has some kind of interaction with another business rule, whose output in turn has some other kind of interaction with another one, the RETE algorithm allows you to not care about the order of these things. You simply define your dependencies, you define what gets outputted, and it can then manage that process of introducing those pieces of data and the interactions between all of those business rules. Now, the other point that I'd like to call out here is the generative tests. Now, some of you may be familiar with this, but other languages certainly don't have it. I was quite surprised and intrigued by this, and that's closure specs. Now, a spec is effectively just a mechanism by which you can define the structure of data, and then it can tell you whether or not a data structure matches your defined spec. Now, you can use this to say add to the inputs of a function. You can say, if you give me this kind of an input that doesn't match my spec, throw an error. And you can also use it on the output of a function. But the real special thing about it is the fact that you can generate data via these specs. And what we do is we use that generated data to pass into our functions to test them a little bit more rigorously. But the other aspect of this is actually to generate data that we then push onto a mock Kafka queue to check whether or not the data that we are creating is conforming with the spec and the schema of our Kafka topics. Now, batch regression testing is interesting enough that it's going to get its own couple of slides. But before we talk about it exactly, I'd like to just bring us back to this architecture. And in particular, I'd like us to focus on the decision engine as a whole, and that single input topic, that aggregate structure, and the single output decision that's been made. Now, the idea here is that aggregate structure is an event log, i.e. we have multiple loan applications and multiple versions of each loan application that feed the decision engine. And then when we start talking about the batch test, it looks something like this. So as you can see here in our mock event log, we've got L1 and L2. These are two different loan applications. And between them, there are 5 different versions of those 2 different loan applications, version 1, 2, and 3 for loan 1, and versions 1 and 2 for loan 2. Now, what we will do is we will take the control version of our engine, normally the production instance, that we'll create externally. We'll create another copy of that instance to run this event log through, and we'll take in a test version of the engine, our proposed change, and we'll run the event log through and then put that in. Now, it's important to stress here that this event log is a windowed time of the production data. So it could be a month, maybe 2 months. But what we're talking about is real world data. These are real applications from real businesses and people. And the reason that we do this testing, partly because the decision engine, as I mentioned before, is complicated, and it tests a whole bunch of areas that we may not have thought of as engineers, but is because Risk finds this testing most useful. So the tests that we kind of talked about before are obviously human written tests, whereas these tests have an element of randomness that you just can't create by manually creating data or manually massaging data. So what we'll then do is we'll take those results, put them into a database, and we'll start comparing them to see if we've got any positive or negative regressions, and then go on and move forward with that. So once we've kind of implemented our testing and run our batch test, we then move to the release document. Now, this is a convergence of the requirements of engineering, data, and risk. So in this document, we're detailing the tests that we've performed, and actually any analysis that an engineer might have done on that batch regression test. And then similarly, a risk person will also go and work with that data and check any edge cases that they might think of, or any regressions that they need to look into as well. Now, the idea here is that they may even go so far as to re-implement what's happening within the database, just to kind of check what's happened. But again, what we're doing here is we're building trust, we're building that rapport with risk to show them that the thing that we're building actually is the thing that we built. We were accurate in the change that we made. Now, the other section that's really useful of this is detailing of data changes. Now, as mentioned before, being a complex system, there are many different data points that we produce as part of our decisions. And what we can do here is we can detail any new fields or even the changes to existing fields of data, and explain those to data and give them a level of provenance that they otherwise wouldn't get. Now, as we all know, data is incredibly important to the vast majority of companies nowadays. And actually this sort of formalization of presenting the new data and any changes to data allows data to have a cleaner understanding before it even reaches the data lake. And this obviously helps drive better analytics. The final point here is obviously from an audit perspective, it's really useful. We cut a new release when we produce one of these release documents, and it helps us to understand potentially if we've made any mistakes. We can go back and we can look at why the testing didn't find those mistakes. And that is it pretty much in summary. So I think the thing to kind of take away here is that when you have a situation where the danger of getting something wrong and the cost of getting something wrong is so immediate and so impactful, actually pooling all of your business logic into a single system and then covering it with this kind of governance process really allows you to actually move very safely and move accurately. Now, actually what we found is that particularly working remotely, this has been incredibly useful, partly for onboarding new engineers and partly just keeping those communication channels open. Having that living documentation that you can work through and use is really beneficial. And again, kind of the thing to stress here is that we're communicating with risk, we're detailing the changes that have happened, and we're showing that we're confident and they're confident in the changes that we've made. And with that, I'd like to say thank you for listening. I hope I haven't bored you all too much, and I'd like to open it up to any questions.
Hi, Hassan. Thank you so much. What a brilliant talk. Oh my goodness, what a way to kind of send us off at the end of the day. Amazing.
Thank you.
Okay, so first question, why did you choose to work at Funding Circle?
So I think it's a couple of things. One was it's a very interesting tech stack. So it's got heavy use of Kafka event logs. And that wasn't something that I'd really worked for in a particular capacity at all. The other aspect of it was ultimately what Funding Circle do. So my previous role was within finance, and I knew I wanted to stay in a kind of like a financial industry and financial business. But I think it's the thing that Funding Circle is making a material difference to a small business. And that's just like, even my next door neighbor who sells flowers and has a little florist shop, they could come to Funding Circle and get some financing to help them grow and employ more people. So it makes a material impact to actual people in the UK. And that's something that I don't think you can really put a price on.
Absolutely. It is such a fantastic organisation. Like, I know I'm incredibly biased because I do work with your wider team quite heavily, but it really, really is really great. Love that. And then, okay, another question we've had is, how does Funding Circle use machine learning and tech in general to deliver, an amazing customer experience to those small businesses?
So ultimately, I think it's the primacy of data. And a lot of what we do is ultimately that use of data to help drive better understanding of how people work, and particularly interact with the website. I'm not sure I can really speak to the machine learning stuff, but I think it's that understanding of data, and it's the use of events to understand how data moves and produces a better insight into what people are doing.
And are you able to talk to us about kind of any, really interesting challenges that you might not be able to talk about a project you're working on right now, for example, but anything that you've done previously that has been, really exciting for you?
Yeah, so it's quite an interesting one, because a lot of the things that I do from the outside are not overly interesting, but I think it's the way in which you have to communicate. So one previous example was something that Risk has identified and said that we can't have the current processes of this manual exception working in the way that they are. And that led me down this really interesting rabbit hole of trying to understand a huge number of different business processes, talking to underwriters, talking to Risk themselves, talking to product people to understand, ultimately what we were trying to achieve. And that was a really enjoyable different set of meetings, really thrashing out what needed to happen, the edge cases around that, some of which was, very back and forth, but it's really rewarding to be able to kind of really nail down what someone needs and someone requires. And again, it's kind of that fear of the buyback, having to fork out such a huge amount of money, and knowing that once that bit of work goes live, we're really kind of protecting ourselves from that huge bit of risk that might otherwise kind of encroach into the system.
Absolutely. And I mean, it's just testament to the organisation, right, that it is so collaborative, that you are able to kind of have those meetings with stakeholders and kind of hash out what you need to hash out and make sure that, you create some really fantastic products there. Incredible. We have had another question. Somebody has asked, what does your kind of typical day look like at Funding Circle?
At the moment, quite a lot of meetings, but I don't begrudge them. So because we're doing a lot of microservices, and again, there's a lot of data that flies back and forth, and in particular because it's actually this thing that I alluded to earlier. There's a lot of coordination from a few different teams to understand what is the data that's making it to the actual user, who's the underwriter who's completing this kind of process, and what's the data that's coming back. How do I understand and manage the different state to potentially reopen something or close something off? So it's a lot of thinking, it's a lot of coordination, and a lot of communicating a solution. That is to say, there's also quite a bit of coding kind of thrown in. I would say, if anyone's got the time or the inclination, Lisp and Clojure in particular is really interesting. Thinking about things in a functional way is a very different way of doing things than object orientation. But yeah, it's a lot of thinking, a lot of communication, and quite a bit of code as well.
Absolutely, which actually leads quite nicely onto our next question. Somebody has asked, how do you avoid bias in the loan process?
Bias, I'm assuming, is within the machine learning
Yes,
data.
which I appreciate. You might be able to only talk about at a high level, definitely, which is totally fine.
Yeah, so I'm not confident enough to answer that question, I'm afraid. I definitely don't know enough about it.
No, not a problem at all. What we'll do, team, is anybody who wants to hear more about that, we can head over to Funding Circle's booth after this session is finished, and we can speak to colleagues there about that. That is not a problem at all. Somebody's asked a question about your regression testing that you were speaking about earlier. How do you ensure that you perform it effectively? And do you do it manually, or is it automated?
Yeah, so it's a good question. So right now it's unfortunately relatively manual in its setup. So you actually need to deploy the image that you want to have for test and control. And then we have timestamps for when the window starts and the window ends. But the nice thing about it is that because all the results end up in a database, and we have a couple of set queries that immediately kind of tell you whether or not you've got the same kind of starting the first time of application and the last time of the last application that you've processed, it means that you've already got an immediate confidence you're talking about the same data window. Because those queries are kind of already set up for you, there is a huge amount of stuff that you can already look at. So it might be, what's the number of offers, what's the distribution of the risk bands, how many different uses of data sources, how many people follow this path where they require this data source, how many people follow that path for this data source. There's a huge amount that's already kind of laid out for you, and you can kind of immediately see if you're expecting a clean regression, let's say where you've just you paid down some technical debt just by refactoring something and you've got it wrong. It's immediately apparent that something's gone wrong kind of straight off the bat. For the most part, you only need to really delve a bit deeper at the point that you're doing something quite complicated. But even then, because we have that risk department, who I think someone's kind of alluded to, it is QA, which they're kind of not. They are very much in the realms of sort of more data analytics, but they're very focused on risk ultimately. I don't know how to describe it other than that, but they will go in and they will do their checks as well. So if there's anything off about what's happened, they'll immediately flag it to you as well and make you run it again.